Hello, everyone, and thank you for your patience as we were experiencing a technical difficulty. We are trying to get our captioning services started. However, for the sake of the time of y'all and for our presenter, we're going to go ahead and get started. And once those captioning services have been sorted, you will begin to see them at the bottom of your screen. So first, welcome to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I am Khadijah Marquardt Davis. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm happy that you're here for this breakout session, Advocacy during the Wisconsin state budget process. For my visual description, I'm a 30-something light-skinned Black woman with long black box braids, and today I'm wearing a black turtleneck and gold hoops, and I also have a pierced nose with a gold hoop in it. As I stated, we are attempting to provide captioning and cart services for everyone here today. And once that gets started, you will see a captioning icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to use this. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website soon. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of the Wukcham-Home Itla, or Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejop, or the Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or from more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as the aim of boarding schools in the state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our work and communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides a space for critical reflection, humility, openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and to move toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward to today in our journey. And so before I go ahead and introduce our speakers today, here are just a few details. So to access this presentation, you will be required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log our attendees and email information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted. And we have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions to our presenter. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we'll not be able to get to all questions submitted, but please refer to the conference website and Eventbrite page for any logistical and CEU information. And so with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Senator LaTonya Johnson. Senator Johnson was elected to Wisconsin's 6th Senate District in 2016. Senator Johnson previously served in Wisconsin's 17th Assembly District. Senator Johnson has lived in Milwaukee for over 30 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Tennessee State University. Before being elected to public office, LaTonya owned and operated a licensed in-home child care center. She served as president of AFSCME Local 502, the union representing in-home child care providers in Milwaukee. She went through Emerge Wisconsin, an intensive training program for progressive women who want to run for office, and is a proud class alum of 2012. In addition to her legislative committee appointments, which includes on the powerful Joint Committee on Finance, Senator Johnson serves on several other commissions and councils related to public safety, democracy, and healthcare. And so it is with my pleasure that I introduce Senator Johnson.
Thank you so much, Khadijah, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you for having me here to explain a little bit about our budget process. It's such an honor to be here with you today because social workers play such a vitally important role in our state. We all know that this state is plagued with issues and racial disparities and economic disparities. But for some, Wisconsin can be just a tremendously wonderful place to live. What I've tried to do in the almost 10 years that I've been here is to try and bring more of that equality to those districts where that are most hardest hit by poverty. The important thing about being on the Joint Finance Committee is because of its power. And it's an opportunity to highlight those issues that are affecting our communities of color across the state, to bring those voices to the table in hopes of getting a little bit of help for those communities. Now, as a policymaker and a member of the budget writing finance committee, it's a huge honor. It's a distinct honor because Wisconsin is extremely unique in the amount of power and influence the Joint Finance Committee has in determining the state's budget. And what's so important about that is because all of us, no matter where you live, we're impacted by the decisions made during the state budget process every single day. From the amount of money that's going into our transportation to the amount of dollars that are going into our schools, our hospitals, our clinics, our municipalities. The state budget determines all that. Now, the state budget is supposed to be a reflection of our state's priorities and our values. And to a large degree, I would say that that's true. But for some communities, it's extremely difficult to see those priorities or those values being reflected in their communities. Because a lot of the economic and racial disparities that we're seeing in some of those zip codes could be remedied just by providing enough resources in those areas. And for me as a state legislature, but especially as an African-American woman, sometimes that's the hardest thing for me to deal with on this budget writing committee, is the fact that I know that there are so many more resources that are needed in these areas that are just not being addressed. So I'll start off by telling you some of the basics about the budget. Each budget is different. Usually the state spends roughly, I would say, about $89 million on the statewide budget. This year, our budget is going to look hopefully increasingly different because we have about $7 billion, and that's $7 billion with a B, in surplus income that we can give back to the communities, and we should give back to the communities. As a matter of fact, that money should have already been spent on some of those issues that need to be addressed, such as infant mortality, our disparities in our school systems and how those are funded. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about today is how the budget is developed. Now, each governor has its own approach in how they want to deal with the budget in terms of what they want to do to help them decide exactly what gets put into the budget. Governor Evers likes to have what he calls his listening sessions, where he gives the community an opportunity to provide input before the budget is drafted in order to find out what all 72 of the counties want to see in their budget, what they feel that their values and priorities are. And I believe that the governor had at least 3 to 4 listening sessions prior to making sure that the budget was complete. And with that information, he accumulated those interests that he heard most to be put into the budget. Then second comes the agency request. Now, the agency request is basically what our departments want to see. So basically, this process is done in even number years. So with the state agencies submitting their budget request to the governor after receiving his guidance on how much their spending limits are going to be set for. And with this information, once they know what their spending limits are, they sit down and they create a budget that goes specifically for their committees. So the state agencies submit their budget requests to the governor. Using these requests, revenue projections, and their own priorities, the governor submits a budget proposal to the Joint Finance Committee. Now, basically, after the agency's proposals, which is done on even numbered years, the governor's proposal is usually the introduction for what the budget will look like. Basically, this is where the Joint Finance formally accepts the budget proposal so they can begin their work on the bill. So after the agency submits their request, then you have the introduction for what basically for what starts off as work on the Joint Finance Committee bill. And then after that is the governor's proposal. So the governor proposal comes after the agency request, if that makes sense. And I hope I'm not confusing anybody because there's a lot of moving parts that I'm trying to put in. Basically, the governor's proposal is done the following year after the even number year. So for example, last year in 2022, all the department heads created their budget based on the limits that the governor set for them. And after their requests were made, the governor then submits his proposal on the odd number year. So this is 2023. So for example, on the 15th, which is Wednesday, February 15th, the governor will have what's called the budget address. And basically, the budget address will be basically what the governor uses to announce to the rest of the state what he feels the priorities are for the state, what he feels is most important based on those listening sessions, based on the agency request. It's basically his financial blueprint for the state and for what the priorities and the values of the state will be. So the governor proposes their preliminary version of the budget. After he does his budget address, which is going to be held on February 15th this year, then the JFC will formally meet to accept an introduction of the budget as a bill. That was the JFC introduction that I was talking about. It's basically the formal process that we use to accept the budget proposal, so then we can begin to do our work on the bill. Now, if you want to take a look at the governor's budget address, you can do so basically by watching any major news station, but you can also watch it on wisconsini.org. That's WISEYE.org. And you'll be able to get a lot of information from that. Now, the budget is roughly about between 1,000 and 1,100 pages. So that's an extremely large document. A lot of the information in those documents are not only the financial aspects, but it's also work that's been done and research that's been done to specifically say why those agencies have asked for that amount of money. It gives you a little bit of background on, say, for example, infant mortality and why the Department of Children and Families or the Department of Human Services feels like more money needs to be put into those aspects. It'll have information on just data, how many infants die per year, how the ages of the children, the causes of the death sometimes, and what are the more likely outcomes and why those particular issues need more investment. So it's a really good document to look at if you're looking for raw numbers and raw data from some of our larger administrative agencies, such as the Department of Human Services, Department of Children and Families, Department of Corrections, Department of Transportation. There's a lot of details that's shared in that formal process. Now, the budget is typically the largest bill with the most spending during any given session. And because the budget is so huge, we usually utilize information from agencies to help us understand exactly what's being put into the budget, also known as budget summaries. Now, this agency that helps with the preparation of that is called the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. And it basically breaks down the issues by department and provide comprehensive summaries of what is included in the governor's proposed budget. And that's extremely helpful, not only for people who are on joint finance, but also for the general public too, to help them understand exactly what the budget actually does and the information that's most pertinent to us making our decisions. Now, this process, because of the complexity of the budget bill, this process typically takes about 3 to 4 weeks for them to create. This means that there's a period of time between the budget address and when the JFC will actually meet, because they give us time to read through the budget ourselves for a little bit of in-depth knowledge, but then you also have those summary briefings that'll come out based on each department that helps to break the information down. What I typically do is that I try to read through the entire budget. Some things I understand and then some things I don't. And that's where this budget summary comes in, because they really give you a just generalization and using general terms of what the information is and why the request is so important. Now, after the introduction piece, you're going to have your agency briefings. Now, for those of us on the committee, this is a period of time where the secretaries of those administrations are invited in, and the staff go over the highlights of their ask, why their ask is important, why they're asking for the amount of dollars that they're asking for. And once the Legislative Fiscal Bureau has released their papers detailing the specifics of the agency's requests, the co-chairs of the committees will then ask 3 to 5 agencies to come in and brief their members on the committees. Now, these are usually some of the larger committees, like some of the ones that I talked about earlier, the Department of Human Services, Department of Corrections, Department of Children and Families, and maybe someone from Transportation and the Department of Natural Resources. They usually take those 3 to 5 major departments and ask them to come in and provide information and specifics about their ask and their request. Now, JFC, I mentioned before, selects specific agencies to come in and talk about their budget. And after that, then we move on to the public hearings. Now, the public hearings are extremely, extremely important. And the reason that they're so important is because that's our opportunity to hear from the members of the community about what they feel is important to be in the budget. And so the community input is always important, because as legislators, we typically make our decisions based on our dollars that we want allocated to the budget. But the community aspect puts a humanized face behind these asks and what specifically the asks are. For example, one of my favorite community organizations that come to absolutely every single hearing is AARP. They come in with those red shirts and they fill those rooms up. It's extremely hard to not understand that organization's issues, because they show up with all of their members every single hearing. It's never a shortage of members. It always seems like it grows. But they're really specific on their ask and how they advocate for our elderly community, which is extremely, extremely important, because that's a sector of our population that's extremely vulnerable, just like our children, just like our people with disabilities. And disability rights, they also play a huge advocacy portion and making sure that they come in and they advocate for the things that are needed in the community. But basically, these public hearings are held following the agency briefings. The Joint Finance Committee hosts public hearings across the state to get input from Wisconsinites. And this is part of the process that has the most opportunity for advocacy. For example, for those individuals that are participating in the public hearings, these meetings are usually packed out. So if you're going to participate, I would suggest arriving early. And I'm not talking about 15 or 20 minutes early. I'm talking about arriving as early as possible, because these hearings are based on a first come, first serve basis. So the earlier that you're there, the closer you have to signing your name in to speak, closer to the top gives you an opportunity to be called first. Now, these hearings generally last all day from about 10 o'clock in the morning till about 6 o'clock at night. And sometimes even with that amount of time allotted, not everybody gets an opportunity to speak. Some people have to leave before the 6 p.m. deadline because they have other responsibilities to take care of. I would also suggest packing a lunch or snacks, because it has the potential to be a long day. Now, you're going to register to speak near the entrance. There will be a table there, someone there to greet you and help you to fill out your registration slips. And you fill out these registration slips based on if you want to testify or not. Now, in these public hearings, we advise everybody to share their thoughts on the budget. What do you like about the budget? What do you dislike about the budget? Is there a specific advocacy that you're advocating for? Or if there's a specific issue that you're advocating for? What I suggest to people is to make talking points. Sometimes people come in and they are super prepared with their 2 to 3 page statements. But on average, each person will only get 2 minutes to speak. So you want to arrange whatever it is that you want to say by putting those top issues, those bullet point headlines, those talking points at the top for what you want to say. And then if you have additional time left, feel free to read, your full statements, but you want to make sure that you have the opportunity to address those main issues of concern that you're there to testify on. That's extremely important, because remember, each person will get on average about 2 minutes. And then if you're going up with a group, you get 5 minutes for the group. Now, if that's something that you want to do, if you want to go up with a group and you just want one person to speak and everybody else, just standing around for support, that's fine too. But if you have multiple people in a group and each person wants to talk, I would suggest utilizing that individual time slot where you get the 2 minute per person, because that's more time and it'll give you more opportunities to speak. If at all possible, please, please, please remember to bring copies of your statements, right? Because you want to be able to leave that document with us when you leave. So if there's ever an opportunity that we want to go back to hear what you had to say on that specific issue, then we have those documents right there in our hand to look over when we're making our decisions about the budget. And that's extremely, extremely important. And remember, everybody's going to be there to advocate about something, and everybody's issues are extremely, extremely important. But we just want to make sure that you get those highlighted issues out first, so we have an opportunity to hear what's most important to you. That's extremely, extremely important. So now we're going to talk about our executive sessions that come up directly after the public hearings. Now, with these executive sessions, once the public hearings have concluded, the committee will start to make changes to the budget through something called an executive session. And this process is not unlike any other bill that makes its way through the legislative process. However, instead of making changes in committee with amendments from members of the JFC, we offer motions. And what I mean by offering motions, before each executive session, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau will put together papers that explain the history of the programs and services that are funded through the state agency. That committee will be meeting on. So basically, the LFB, which is the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, will then offer suggestions or alternatives to the original budget proposal. So during this process, members of the Joint Finance, we can either adopt sections of the state agency as they are proposed, or we can move to adopt one of the other alternative suggestions that are proposed by the LFB, or we can also draft our own motions advocating for something different, for a different type of change. So this is another place and another opportunity where advocates can try to influence what gets included in the state budget by contacting members of the Joint Finance Committee and asking us to support the budget either as is, the way it is originally written, which means the way that the governor proposed, also known as the governor's budget, or we can adopt an alternative if we feel that the governor's budget needs to be amended or changed. We can adopt another alternative or make a different change. But one thing that we have to remember is that the Joint Finance is comprised of 16 members, right? So 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. There are 6 Republican committees from the Assembly, 6 Republican members from the state Senate, and there are 2 members on the Democratic side for the Assembly and 2 members on the Senate side. Now, this budget is going to be passed basically on majority rule. So even though Democrats have 4 members on this committee, the majority of the decisions that will be made in that budget is going to come from the majority side. Remember, I said that there were 12-4. And so basically your GOP members will be making the majority of the decisions regarding the budget. But that doesn't mean that as Democrats, we don't have input, because we do. We get to talk about the issues. We get to talk about why we feel the issues are important. We get to make motions just the same as Republicans do. We get to advocate for those issues that we feel are most important too. But if you live in a district where, where Republican members of the JFC reside, that would be most definitely the first place that I would start with my advocacy, reaching out to your elected official, to your Republican electeds, and saying, look, this is an important issue to me and this is why. But I wouldn't just stop there. I would reach out to every single person on Joint Finance. You can do it through a phone call. You can do it through an email. My preference is emails. You can do it through letters, anything in writing, because then you have a paper trail. And we have documentations that we can actually include and forward with a name, address, so on, so on. But remember, your advocacy is extremely important, because that is what makes the budget items more priority. The more that they hear about these issues and the more you advocate, the more your issue stands to be included in the budget. There are a lot of issues in this state. We all know that. And the majority of those issues are most definitely worthy of getting funding. But if there's one thing that I know from sitting on Joint Finance for these last couple of years, is that my colleagues are going to say, we want to fund everything, but we can't afford to. So we're going to have to pick priorities. So the more you advocate for your issue, the bigger that becomes a priority. And one of the reasons that I said that I'm really partial to social workers, especially in my office. I represent the 6th Senate District in Milwaukee. I represent one of the most expensive zip codes in the city, which is 53203, which is where your Wisconsin Center District, that whole entertainment district, the Pfizer Forum, the Miller High Life Theater, the Convention Center, the downtown Grand Avenue Mall, the Milwaukee Public Museum, all of those major attractions are in my zip code. And a 2-bedroom apartment in that area can cost you anywhere from $1,600 to $2,000 a month. But I also represent one of the poorest zip codes in the city of Milwaukee, also known as 53206, a zip code where the median resale value of a house in that area was just $4,300, and that was prior to COVID. Now, the people that I represent in terms of economics, they are on different spectrums. But the advocacy for both of those issues are exceptionally real, especially for my lower income zip code. Advocating for those issues are extremely, extremely important because we all know the disparities among those who are economically challenged, right? If we have to rely on basically the majority in property taxes to fund our schools, then what does a school in 53206 look like if the median resale value of a home in that area is just $4,300? So making sure that we have people that are coming out to advocate for things that are so important to communities of color become extremely, extremely important. Because without that advocacy, those issues are going to be the first to be left behind. And that's where you come in and you play a significant role. Because of your background, because of what you do, you understand the dynamics and you understand it in a way that I could never explain and actually get that message across, right? So your advocacy becomes just so important because in some cases, the advocacy that you represent is the only advocacy that those areas get. You know, when I first took the job here, I thought to myself, if poor people had high-paid lobbyists, poverty would be ended. But that's not the case. In this building, you hear people talk about the middle class all the time. You very seldomly hear people talking about the working poor who are just trying to get to the middle class. And you have issues like infant mortality, right? Disparities in educational funding, disparities in how we fund our special needs programs in our schools. Those issues cannot afford to wait. And so having advocates like you, especially trained professionals who understand the dynamics, become even more important than I can even mention, because you are those high-paid lobbyists in terms of what you're bringing to the table for those communities of colors and for people who are just the least of these who don't have the abilities to advocate for themselves. And that's extremely, extremely important. It's extremely important. After the executive sessions, then the budget will go to the full legislature. And basically, when the budget goes to the full legislature for final changes and passages, that's when it gets to the full body and everybody is free to make amendments or free to make changes. Or basically, after making the revisions that we make from the governor's budget, It's then introduced into the joint finance. After the joint finance finishes making their revisions or their changes, then it goes to the full legislature for a vote. Basically, the Joint Finance Committee submits their version of the state budget to the full legislature for review, final modification, and passage. After both houses, both the Assembly and the Senate, after both houses passes identical versions of the state budget, it goes to the governor's desk for signature, for basically signage into law. But that's key. Both the Assembly and the Senate have to agree and pass identical budgets in order for the budget to be ready to be sent to the governor to have it signed into law. And you can contact your legislature during this part of the process to ask for their support for the state budget and for your issues as well, because everybody plays a part in whether they vote for or against this budget. Now, the governor, after it's passed in the full legislature, the governor will either sign it into law or he can veto it. Or he can do a partial veto or a full veto. A full veto would mean there's nothing in this budget that I like or agree with. I'm not going to sign it. We're going to send it back to the drawing board. And basically, the joint finance would have to start over. This is also known as conference committee. If the two houses end up passing versions of the bill that are significantly different from each other, then there's something called a conference committee consisting of members from each house, is usually appointed to come up with something that, or a version that can be agreed upon. So basically, when I talked about it passing, both houses having to pass identical versions of the bill before it could go to the governor's office to be signed into law. Now, if both houses can't agree on or pass the same version, then that will go to something called a conference committee. And basically in this conference committee, they would basically appoint people to be assigned to the conference committee that would be responsible for coming up with a version of the bill that is most agreed upon. And once the compromise is reached, it goes back to both houses for approval. No amendments or changes are allowed at this point. There's just a yes or no vote. Now, that's worst case scenario. I've never seen a case where anything has had to go to a conference committee. I highly doubt that would ever happen. But our governor does have one of the strongest veto pens, I would say, in the country. Right? Because our governor can either fully veto the bill, like I said earlier, he can say that there's nothing in this budget that I like or that I agree with, and I'm just not going to sign it. I'm going to veto it. You have to go back to the table and start over, right? Or he can do a line item veto, which means that he partially vetoes things without having to veto the whole budget, which means he can take his pen, cross out specific letters or phrases so the bill would state something different. So, for example, if a bill said, allocation of, I don't know, let's just say 10 million for special needs, right? Or let's say, 10 million for special needs, or we're just using this as an example. Special needs and general purpose funds. That'll never happen, but we'll just use that as an example. So the governor could cross out and general purpose funds and just allocation of $10 million for special needs. And it completely says something totally different. So that is one of the privileges that our governor has here in Wisconsin that's not readily available in other states. So we talked about the partial veto and the full veto. I also talked about how the governor could cross out whole items. He can also change dollar values too, and that's extremely, extremely important. And he has done that before. He can delete certain words or language from the document. What he cannot do is add words or numbers. So he can take things away, but he can't add to. So that's extremely important. And it takes a lot of sophistication to get that right. So you can best believe that the governor has some really smart people on his team to make sure that they cross those lines out at exactly the right place. To actually get to where he wants to go, because he can't add additional language or numbers. So our state laws basically say that the budget must be enacted by July 1st of odd number years. So by July 1st of 2023, our budget should have passed. However, it is possible that the budget process may take longer, and I have seen it take longer before. And if that happens, our state just operates on the budget, on our last session's budget. So it just means that our state doesn't shut down or anything like that. We continue to operate. We just operate under the previous budget spending limits. So if you have certain issues that we're going to get additional dollars, they would have to wait, or certain departments that would get additional dollars, they would have to wait until the new budget is passed for that, because the limits would be stuck at the previous budget limits. So basically, one other thing that I'll talk to you about is basically the 4 segments of funds and what those are. So when you hear the term GPR, which is general purpose revenue, those are just appropriations financed from general purpose revenues available in the state's general fund. And when I talk about general purpose revenue, we're talking about taxes, individual income, sales and use taxes, corporate income franchises. Those are all things that would be held under your general purpose funds, such as public utilities, cigarette sales, the money from taxes on that, tobacco products, vape products, liquor, wine, beer, insurance. Those are the items that are in your general purpose fund. The next fund that we have is called our federal fund, or FED, just FED. And basically, those are appropriations financed from federal revenues. Those are the federal dollars that come into the state that help us to make our budgets, basically. Next, we have something called segregated funds, also known as SEG. These appropriations are used for specific purposes. So say, for example, if I wanted to put $1 million in the budget for early childhood education, but I wanted to make sure that that $1 million is only spent for early childhood education, then I could put that money in what's called segregated funds, meaning that it would only be used for that purpose. The next is program revenue. That's another allocation. And that these are appropriations financed from program revenues such as user fees or product sales. And basically, the 4 of these different money pots are what the state uses to make up our budget. So with that being said, I'll stop. And if there's any questions, I'll answer them. Or if I've confused you somewhere along the way, I'll go back and try to clarify. I know that this is a lot of information to take in. It was a lot of information for me to learn. But I will say that if you only take one thing out of this session, the thing that's most important is your advocacy. Show up at those public hearings, write letters, have your organizations to write letters. If it's too difficult for you to write your own letter, Form letters work great, where people just fill in their name and their address, and the letter is written for them about their specific issue. Postcards do the same thing. Those form postcards, they work fine. You just want as many advocates as possible to advocate for those issues. The other thing that you want to do is explain it as clearly as possible so that everyday people can understand and us electeds can understand too. Remember, you are the expert at what you're advocating for. Your job is to get us to understand what the issue is and how important it is. Feel free when you are talking about the issues that you want to have addressed or you're seeking revenue for, to tell stories surrounding those issues. That gives us, even if we don't remember your name, right? We will remember that story. That becomes important. So right up there with what, your bullet points or your talking points about the issues, share a story. When I'm on the floor and I'm talking about issues, I always, 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 as much as possible, try to include a story because that makes it personal. It breaks those issues down in everyday layman's terms where people can understand. One of the issues that became really, really important when I first joined finance was home health care, and the fact that people weren't able to get home health aides because the pay was so low. So you had people that had jobs to go to, but they couldn't because they didn't have any home assistance with help getting ready. Parents came in and talked about how they had issues with even going to work because they had problems getting home health aides, even those individuals who were paying privately out of pocket. Those stories mattered. And we heard them so frequently, and the stories became so real. That was definitely one of the things that we financed. We also put a pay increase in the budget for that specific issue. Other things that we heard about: early childhood education, making sure that our most vulnerable, our kids, had an opportunity to go to daycare, and making childcare more affordable and allowing pay raises for those employees to make sure that the daycares were able to retain them. We all saw during the pandemic just how important childcare was. So making sure that advocacy was on part became extremely important, because that advocacy led to additional resources being provided for early childhood education, so those providers could get raises and the employers could afford to pay their staff more. So with that being said, I'll open it up to questions if there are any, or if there's anything else that you want me to address.
There are questions. So first, thank you so much, Senator Johnson, for providing all that really, really great information. Yes, I would like to invite participants to enter some questions into the chat. We do have some here, but yeah, feel free to keep them coming. So the first question we have is, how do election years affect the process of the state agencies and governor making their budget proposals? So, and they stated, thinking of the state agencies making their proposal last year, not knowing how the election would go until November. So do people still submit their requests, and how does all of that get handled?
I'm sorry. The question, camera, I lost you for
half a second there. Yeah. Would you like me to repeat the question? Oh no, we might be having technical difficulties now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. I'm going to repeat the question, okay?
Uh-huh.
All right. So how do election years affect the process of the state budget? So for example, state agencies will typically submit their requests to the governor before an election will happen. So how does that work out? Do they still, submit those requests even if the election hasn't happened until November? Because what would happen if the governor didn't get reelected?
Oh, see, is-
Oops, Senator Johnson, I think you're still coming in and out here.
right.
Sorry, y'all. Oh, you're muted, Senator Johnson.
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. All right, we're
Okay.
gonna try. We're gonna try this question one more time. I thank everyone in the audience for your patience. It's just been a day of technical difficulties, and we're rocking with it. All right, how do election years affect the budget? Oh, no, she might be frozen again.
Okay, so the answer is yes.
Yes. Oh no. All right, y'all. We just lost Senator Johnson. We're going to take 1 second here to get her back online. But yes, the budget process is impacted by elections. And once she returns, we'll get into it more here.
Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully this is
No,
it's not. Oh
no.
my God.
Are you able to sit? Is it better at your desk?
So my desktop. Let me see.
Or not your desktop, but can you pick up your laptop and move to your desk?
Not on my phone because let's see if that'll work.
Yeah. And now, yeah, everyone can get a little quick view of what it looks like inside of a legislative office as well. There we go.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So the answer to that question is yes. So the administration, the department secretaries would still submit their budget the same as they would any other time on the even numbered years. Now, if the administration changes, then of course they would go back to the drawing board and start over with the new administration. So everything would still go basically the same. The only thing that the elections do is for Republicans. For example, with the surplus dollars that we received at the time, we thought we had about $6 billion in surplus dollars. Governor Tony Evers wanted to give some of that money back to the community. He wanted to give everybody $100, basically $100 direct payout to help offset inflation, the cost of gas, the cost of food, and that was per person in each household. The Republicans decided that they didn't want to do that they were going to wait and see who would win the election before they decided to provide direct help to residents. Governor Evers won re-election. So now does that conversation start with us talking about how we are going to help the community? And so politics does have a huge, does play a huge role in how dollars are allocated, but some things remain the same, such as the department secretaries completing their budget. That part doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the attitudes toward those who are running for office and whether they'll come back or not, and their ability to make decisions like those direct payouts or emergency disbursements, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. Yep. And we have another question. So where does social work fall in the budget, and how much of that money is invested in the community and into families?
Okay, so for this term, we don't know um, if there's going to be any money allocated toward social work or toward those issues. But I will definitely tell you how our state is hurting from not having enough social workers. We hear every single day about the lack of social workers that are available in the state. The Milwaukee Bureau of Child Welfare, for the longest time, had a requirement basically for a preference for hire for individuals who were degreed social workers, right? They had to change that requirement because they didn't have enough social workers to apply. And they had to open that up to basically any candidates now, right? So we're definitely seeing that social work pipeline dwindle. That's one of the reasons that I consider myself so lucky, because my chief of staff has a master's degree in social work. And then Khadijah used to work for our office and she has a degree in social work. They become extremely important, especially for communities like mine, in terms of the type of legislation that I introduce. I rely heavily on my staff in terms of getting their input on legislation, how it would affect the community, the best resources that we have to provide for the community. And I would say that there's a huge need for social workers in politics too, because you understand the communities and the issues so much better than we can. And for a lot of the schools, they're suffering from lack of social workers, and the state knows that we don't have enough social workers available in the state. So social workers become extremely, extremely important, especially social workers of color.
Thank you. And then another question we have is, how do we find out when public hearings are scheduled?
Perfect, perfect question. So when those dates are announced, they will be published. They will be published online. We will put them in our newsletters. The governor will announce those dates. So you will have ample opportunity to make sure that you will have time to attend one of those dates. They usually try to break the state up into at least 4 different regions where they get a centralized location close to each one of the central areas or the central regions, and they have listening sessions there. Exactly what the dates are this year, I don't know. I'm not sure that they've been announced yet, but once they are available, we'll definitely make sure that they're publicized.
Yep, and the governor always likes to put that on his website. So if you literally just search Tony Evers, his website will pop up, and it'll probably be like one of the first things you see as well. So definitely look out for those.
And the one thing that I will say is that the governor puts his priorities in that budget for things that he feels that's important to this state. It's our responsibility to go out and to defend those allocations, because in most cases, the governor thinks about and addresses issues because of community inputs that my Republican colleagues, it becomes a second thought. In most cases, most budget cycles, we're always met with the opposition that we don't have the money. Every issue is important, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the money to invest. They can't say that this year because we have $7 billion with a B as a surplus. That money is there. The question is, how are they going to spend it? Are they willing to address those issues that are hitting our communities of colors exceptionally hard? And where are they going to allocate those dollars to? That's the key. But making sure that you come out to defend those allocations in the budget and let us know that those issues are important to you, those dollars are important to you, is extremely important.
All right. So another question that we have, is, would you say that public hearings would be the most effective way to advocate for school funding reform?
Yes, 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 yes. The public hearings are extremely an effective way, but also so is emailing the individuals on joint finance, so is writing letters. If you cannot attend, then that's okay. You can also submit that information in writing to each one of us on joint finance. That's important. And then once it's done in joint finance, then you also have another opportunity to contact your elected official if they're not on joint finance and tell them what's important to you. Because remember, you have the governor who does the primary bill for the state budget. Then it goes to the joint finance. So you have this opportunity. And then after joint finance, it then goes to the full body. So you also have that opportunity too. So most definitely showing up at the hearings is important. We like to see numbers come out. We like to hear those stories repeated over and over and why it's important, but it's not the only way to advocate for the budget.
All right, so we have another one. Has there ever been a discussion about funding for schools not coming from the district's tax base, but from one large pot of money so that education is more equally provided regardless of district?
So we have had those conversations. As a matter of fact, you see county after county coming up with their own referendums to try and fund education, which is just flat out wrong because they're already paying for a quality education, or they should be through their taxes. But when they take on those referendums, they're saying, look, we're willing to pay additional funds outside of what we're already paying. We just need this specific item done for our school. So referendums are about the only other way that they've had conversations about making education more equitable. I definitely don't think that the tax piece is equality for anybody. I know last year Governor Evers put in an additional $75, just $75 per pupil for children who were living in disadvantaged zip codes or areas that were most impoverished. And the Republicans pulled that completely out of the budget. And $75 isn't a lot. But for those kids that are attending those disadvantaged schools, it was the start, a small step in trying to help to bridge that gap for equality. I also know that Governor Evers plopped in a lot of money from the American Rescue Fund to help fund our schools, and that helped to move our schools back into the top 10, a place that we weren't before all the extra investments that Governor Evers has done. Our one saving grace when it comes to education is the fact that Governor Evers used to be the state superintendent, so he gets it. So education is his utmost priority. And the fact that he allocates so much additional funding to education, the fact that he line item vetoes those areas where he feels that education isn't funded enough speaks volumes. But I agree with you. We do need to have those hardcore conversations that make education more equitable around the state. And that includes extra resources for those areas that are hardest hit by low-income families.
So that is actually all of the questions that we have coming in. So unless there is any more questions, do you have any closing remarks or anything else you would like people to say before I launch into some admin things that people need to know?
No. Again, thank you for your interest in politics, especially as social workers. I cannot iterate enough the importance that you guys bring to these conversations, the real life experience that you bring to the table. Your degrees mean a lot. And, social workers are a very well looked upon, profession in this state. Something that we know on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, that more of you are needed in this state. You will not get an argument about that. And the fact that you're willing to lend your voice to those issues that you care most about, those issues that you are the expert in, speaks volumes. Like I said before, you become those high paid lobbyists that, you know, disadvantaged communities don't have. And you're one of the resources that people will listen to. So thank you for willing to be a part and for willing to advocate and for sharing your knowledge with the rest of us, because your knowledge is so very, very needed, especially in times like this where, you know, our disadvantaged are hit the hardest and they are most often so easily forgotten about. So thank you.
Yes, thank you again. All right, so just have some closing things before we release you all. So once again, many thanks to Senator Johnson for sharing their time and expertise and valuable information with us here today. And thank you for everyone who attended. I know we experienced some technical difficulties, and I appreciate you all hanging in there with us. And for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Please watch for an email with a link to complete an evaluation of today's conference, including this panel, and then also watch out for a separate email regarding CEUs for those that request them and when they registered. But yeah, we hope that you will join us for the closing plenary that will be provided by Imani Barbrin of Crutches and Spice. That will start at 2 p.m. So feel free to go ahead and take a quick break and then come back and join us for more content. But thank you so much. And once again, Senator Johnson, we really appreciated having you with us today.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.